At the beginning of the 20th century, the French millionaire Albert Kahn established the most ambitious photographic project the world had ever seen. By using film and the brand new medium of color photography, he sought to preserve the everyday lives of people from all around the globe. He hoped that his images would capture our common humanity and promote peace. In the years leading up to the First World War, Kahn sent photographers to more than 20 countries in Europe. For the most part, the pictures they took record contented people living in a tranquil continent. But as they moved east, the photographs tell another story, one of rising national and ethnic tensions that would plunge the whole of Europe and much of the world into war.
This is the first time that any of these shots would have been taken in colour. There's nothing else like it that I've ever seen.
I found these photographs, when I saw them for the first time, incredibly moving because they brought home to me, like I think no documents had done, the catastrophic human impact of the Balkan Wars.
The Kahn archive is an epitaph for a vanished world, one that was destroyed by the explosion of war in 1914. The faces that we see, the ways that people lived, their gestures are very remote from us now. We have the world destroyed but preserved. That's the achievement of the Kahn archive.
In 1908, at his home just outside Paris, the French banker and philanthropist Albert Kahn began devising his hugely ambitious plan to create an archive of the planet. The following year, he launched the project in earnest by recruiting his first professional photographer. Auguste Léon had worked for some time as a postcard photographer. He was meticulous and skillful with cameras. For the next 20 years, Kahn dispatched Léon all over Europe with the new autochrome camera system. Some of his earliest pictures were shot in the picturesque Loire Valley in northeast France. Before the First World War, he also traveled to the area of Puy-de-Dôme, one of the largest départements in central France. Puy-de-Dôme's landscape is studded with ancient volcanic hills. Today, its capital, Clermont-Ferrand, is a thriving industrial city, home to the giant Michelin tire company. But a century ago, it was still a sleepy backwater that came to life on market days. Outside the city, Léon encountered a people who remained intimately connected to the land.
This is very reminiscent of my childhood. There was a lot of farming in the area, and that was the main form of income. I used to see these carts going through my village. Work was very hard. They didn't have a very good yield. But the people didn't demand much. They were quite content.
Many people still wore the traditional local costume and spoke the regional dialect or patois. At the turn of the century, a schoolteacher observed that just a few miles outside Clermont-Ferrand, very few adults spoke French.
The patois of each region had a different pronunciation, and there was a great problem understanding people from elsewhere. The patois from one place was spoken differently from the patois spoken 60 kilometers away.
The same was true in other areas visited by Kahn's photographers, including Brittany in western France. Here people spoke the Breton language and lived according to rituals and traditions that were unique to the region.
France was a collage of languages, of cultures, of different religious practices, and of a great deal of pride in that very difference. Those who came from the Puy-de-Dôme area would never be confused with people who came from Provence or people who came from the west of France.
But some nationalist politicians viewed these regional differences as a threat to the unity of France. They wanted to promote a shared national culture. But this would have undermined the cultural diversity that fascinated Albert Kahn.
I think that the main reason why Albert Kahn wanted to have photographs of the regions of France was because this was also a time when the rural populations were part of a new French identity that was being forged at that time. Differences being ironed out. More and more people who live in France are expected to speak French, where the Minister of Education knows at any time of any day what each school class is doing. You brought this great country, which had been very diverse, and made it into one singular entity.
In the years before the outbreak of World War I, increasing conflict between the nations of Europe edged the continent towards the brink of war. Governments tried to instill in their people a greater sense of loyalty and national pride.
It was widely felt that developing a strong sense of national identity was very important, because by the late 19th century it was accepted that a war would have to be a mass war involving millions of young men, and it's crucial that those young men felt patriotic and willing to fight and die for their country.
But Kahn's autochromes hint at a serious problem facing the French nation.
Léon's portrayal of the fertility of France has a double edge to it. On one hand, it's a rural idyll. It has a beauty of its own. On the other hand, the land in many of these photographs is empty, and this is a problem. The problem is that the strength of France could only be maintained if people stayed on the land and if its population grew. Neither was the case. The rural France of these photographs is depopulated. It's a place where people don't have large families anymore, or if they do, the children scatter.
Because of changing social attitudes and the increased use of birth control, France had the lowest birth rate in Europe. At a time of mounting international tensions, this demographic time bomb became a matter of national security.
To portray the countryside, the source of great vitality and strength, as depopulated is a very important issue. You can see in front of your eyes why the French army might not be a match to the German.
The German population was growing more than 6 times faster than the French. By the eve of the First World War, when Germany was mobilizing its forces, they enjoyed a huge military advantage. Their army had 2.5 million more soldiers than the French. As a committed pacifist, Kahn abhorred the imminent prospect of war. He tried to promote understanding between people of different cultures. Through his collection of autochromes, he wanted to celebrate the colourful tapestry of European life.
Europe in 1910 was a Tower of Babel. There were over 100 languages or dialects spoken quite normally in most major states. There was extraordinary diversity, cultural, linguistic, physical diversity, different colors, different skins, different languages, different religions. The enormous variety of European life in 1910 has vanished over the century. But if we go back 100 years, we can see a very different world.
In 1910, Kahn accompanied his photographer, Auguste Léon, to Scandinavia, a region in the throes of momentous change. These black and white photographs offer a rare glimpse of Kahn on his journey through Norway.
The impression one gets from those fleeting photographs we have of him on his trip to Norway, of somebody who is enjoying himself in the business of travelling, who's looking out, who's gazing at the world, drinking things in with his eyes.
Today, Norway is one of the most affluent countries in the world. But in 1910, Kahn encountered many impoverished Norwegians living in dilapidated conditions. At that time, Norway was so poor that the country stood on the brink of famine. Each year its population dwindled as thousands sought a better life in America. Kahn and Léon visited the site of one of the new industrial projects that many hoped would bring prosperity to Norway, a huge hydroelectric complex above the town of Rjukan. Léon's autochromes capture a pristine landscape. 6 years later, the valley had changed beyond all recognition. In a few years, Rjukan's population swelled from 350 to 10,000 as Norwegians flocked to the town in search of work. Other photographs taken on this journey show the natural beauty of Norway. The country's unique stave churches testify to the skill and artistry of Norwegian craftsmen. These pictures represent a land of apparently enduring traditions. But beneath the surface, Norway was coming to terms with profound political change. For almost a century, an act of union had joined Norway to Sweden. In 1905, the union had been dissolved, leaving Norway to establish itself as a newly independent state.
Norway had been developing its sense of national identity very strongly in a number of fields in the 19th century as a means of defining itself in contrast to Sweden. There are examples in art, literature, music, language. Sweden had to reposition itself. The Swedes had to discover what Sweden actually was. It obviously was not Sweden plus Norway. And now the Swedes were left on their own, so to speak.
In Sweden, Kahn found a country which was also in the grip of an economic and demographic crisis.
It's a time of social upheaval, people supporting revolutionary movements, and also the life was changing quite significantly for many of the people in these pictures as well.
The country's harsh climate meant that those who worked on the land endured a precarious existence. Failed harvests could lead to starvation. Increasingly, the younger and more enterprising abandoned the country. By the early 20th century, a fifth of all Swedes had crossed the Atlantic heading for America. As the population declined, nationalists tried to encourage people to remain in their homeland.
The people who were needed to build the modern Sweden were disappearing much too quickly. And so celebrating, trying to establish what traditional Swedishness was an important part, if you want, of the project of encouraging people to stay in the country.
At the time of Leon's visit, life in much of rural Sweden remained untouched by the modern world. The embodiment of the eternal Swedish idyll was in the western region of Dalarna.
It was a kind of Swedishness that outsiders, tourists, and somebody like Leon certainly, I would have thought were very keen to see, because it confirmed that these were traditional people leading traditional lives, which would have been very reassuring at a time when Sweden was changing pretty rapidly with urbanization, industrialization, and so on.
On his journey to Dalarna, Leon encountered Swedish farmers at work in the fields.
The return from the summer pastures is an extremely interesting picture. Types of jobs that men and women did were very clearly different and very clearly divided. It was the job of women to look after the cattle up on these pastures. There were no fences, of course, so you had to stay with your cattle all the time during the day when they were grazing. And there was also the danger of bears and wolves attacking the cattle.
When Leon arrived in this town in Dalarna on a Sunday, he found the local people dressed for church.
What we see in the picture are two girls in their Sunday finery, and also a very stern-looking man. And he is wearing his long black coat, which he would only have worn on a Sunday for going to church.
Folk costume had survived longer in Dalarna than in some of the other regions of Sweden. By the end of the 19th century, it was more prevalent for high days and holidays as a Sunday best, which is why the people are all dressed up here.
Encouraged by the results of their expedition to Scandinavia, Kahn expanded his project. In 1912, he appointed a director to manage his growing archive. Jean Brun was a distinguished academic. After Kahn endowed a chair for him at the prestigious Collège de France, he became the world's first professor of the emerging discipline of human geography. Brun believed that photography had the potential to help the world understand the impact of human activity on the planet.
That question of how do you map the world is no longer a matter of maps. It's a matter of photographs and film. Together with Jean Brun, Kahn's project could really expand and his ambition could grow.
For the next 20 years, Brun executed Kahn's plan to create a visual encyclopedia of the planet.
Jean Brun tried to formulate the wish of Kahn in very concrete terms. What to photograph, how to photograph, And we have, for example, a list that indicates the important elements which photographers must observe when taking a photo.
Brun used Kahn's autochromes to accompany his lectures, bringing colourful images of the world to a wider public. And he also joined Kahn's photographers on their missions. With the photographer Auguste Léon, Brun embarked on his first foreign trip to Italy in 1912. Since the late 18th century, Italy's sumptuous artistic and architectural heritage made it the ultimate destination on the Grand Tour. A visit to cities like Florence and Venice was de rigueur for cultured members of Europe's wealthy elite.
Well, people who went to Italy would have gone with a perception of a romantic and beautiful country, a country of ruins, of great art, of great churches, great cathedrals, and this is what they would have sought out.
Venice, Florence, Tuscany in general were already, if you like, part of an itinerary. Those are the kind of places that any upper-class Northern European would go to. This is a brilliant picture of Florence and the tourist trade. It shows how developed tourism was already at the turn of the century, and also the presence of all those probably fairly cheap reproductions of famous artistic works.
As well as recording Italy's historic buildings, Brun and Léon wanted to reflect the everyday life of the Italian people. During this trip and on subsequent visits, Kahn's photographers produced pictures showing the gritty reality of life in Italy.
The Venetian picture taken at Campo Bandiera is very interesting because it shows a snapshot of working class life in those years. As you can see, particularly the house on the right-hand side is the typical house where working class people would live. At the time, the ground floors of buildings in Venice, which were called magazzini, which means storehouse, were not supposed to be lived in by people because they were particularly unsanitary because of the dampness, and there were actually infiltrations from the sewage system. But because of lack of housing, slowly those ground floors were packed in with poor migrants, and Venice, even in the 20th century, was a potential place for epidemics of cholera. It's interesting to see those children there happily climbing on top of a well. The sad side behind this picture is the fact that probably many of these children were actually working in the glass industry, which employed children from the age of 10 working 14, 15 hours day shifts. In a way, it's a beautiful picture, but at the same time a reminder of the poor social conditions of working class Venetians at the time.
Well, Italy on the eve of the First World War, in about 1912-13, when a lot of these photographs are taken, was one of the poorest countries in Europe, with levels of income probably comparable to Spain or perhaps Russia, so really very poor indeed. The vast majority of people were peasants living in very poor conditions, suffering from serious illnesses. In southern Italy, a lot of people would experience malaria. And diet was very, very poor. It was very rare for people to eat meat ever, perhaps once a year or just on major feast days. Life expectancy at birth in Italy was among the lowest in Europe.
In theory, primary education was compulsory in Italy, but in reality, few parents sent their children to school. At the time of unification, only 3% of adults spoke Italian, and the country remained a patchwork of separate cultures.
Italy's history for centuries had been a history of regional identities, local ones, particularly related to towns. So Italians were, and are to a great extent, first and foremost Milanese, Venetian, Tuscan, and then there is this sense of being part of a national community.
Since Italy's unification, politicians had tried to widen the perspectives of ordinary Italians and make them identify with the nation. Some nationalists believed the country could be unified through the revolutionary power of warfare.
A lot of Italian intellectuals felt that the only way that Italy is going to be strong, that it's going to somehow shake off all the legacy of the past, that somehow through success in war, a nation will be made through sacrifice, through bloodshed. There will be collective memories as a result of this traumatic experience, and that somehow a great power will be made.
The military was considered to be an instrument for building a more cohesive Italian nation.
The army also worked as a kind of melting pot where people from different regions would meet for the first time. And because Italy was such an agricultural country at the time, people would travel very little. So quite often being in the army was a chance to be able to travel and meet other people for the first time for the vast majority.
While Italy consolidated its status as a unified nation, in the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire was breaking apart.
By the time Kahn sends his teams of photographers to southeastern Europe, this is clearly a focal point for political transition from a world of empires to a world of nation-states, and a focal point that does not only concern the peoples of the area, but concerns the whole of Europe.
But the Western European idea of a nation-state couldn't be easily applied to the Balkans, where a myriad of ethnic and national groups shared the same geographical space. As the people of the region competed for control of territory, the potential for conflict increased. Jean Brun believed that photography could help Europeans understand the complexities of politics in the Balkans.
They wanted, as many travelers did, to sort out for the audiences back in Western Europe, where after all the real political power lay, who was who in the Balkans. And of course they do all this on the eve of the First World War that's going to blow apart the European order forever. The commonplace about the Balkans was it was an ethnographic mess. It was a Macedon. It was a fruit salad of different nationalities, and the political problem of Europe is sorting it out. And photography, by fixing and identifying the different human tribes that existed there, could help in this task.
For decades, conflict between the region's ethnic groups had given the Balkans a reputation for violence. In the early years of the 20th century, the area had become a source of morbid fascination for travelers. Agatha Christie invented a villainous character who, as she put it, came from one of the Balkan states. Principal rivers, unknown. Principal mountains, also unknown. Population, chiefly brigands. Hobby, assassinating kings and having revolutions.
If you read the headlines in 1911 or 1912 coming out of the Balkans, you would think that assassination is a daily event. Anyone in Western Europe or Central Europe knew a flashpoint for war.
Brun and Leon had arrived between the First and Second Balkan Wars, two conflicts that transformed the balance of power in the region.
These pictures were taken at a very crucial moment because of the two Balkan Wars, which changed totally the map of the region, but also the lives of people who are photographed on these pictures. Maybe some of them had to leave their homes. Maybe some of them were killed.
In the winter of 1912, an alliance of Balkan armies had attacked the forces of their Ottoman overlords. Within 6 weeks, they'd claimed victory. Ottoman rule in Europe was at an end. But the scramble over its former territory, in what is modern-day Macedonia, had only just begun. Brun and Leon arrived in Macedonia just weeks after the defeat of the Ottomans in the spring of 1913. Salonika, which is known today as the Greek city of Thessaloniki, was the most important port in the Balkans. The gateway to Macedonia and the provinces beyond, it was a vibrant, cosmopolitan city where people of diverse religious and ethnic backgrounds mixed freely together.
Although there were some areas of the city that were chiefly inhabited by Muslims, others by Jews, others by Christians, it was not strictly segregated. So every time you went down into the port or the quay, or you went to the cinema, or you visited the market, everybody was there. There were not separate markets for different national groups.
In the Ottoman Empire, religion was the main difference between people, and this was also the main element of their identities. So if you went to the Balkans, like these photographers at that time, and you asked who you are, people would say, I'm Christian, I'm Orthodox, I'm Catholic, I'm Jew, I'm Muslim. They were identifying themselves according to their religion.
The empire was not interested in ethnicity. It ruled by allowing different religious communities a high degree of autonomy and self-government. Basically, as long as they paid their taxes and didn't cause trouble, the empire was not very bothered about what they did.
At the turn of the century, a Jewish boy, Leon Siaki, was growing up in Salonika. In his memoirs, he recalled life in this diverse society.
The lower group in which I was placed was made up of 3 French boys, 1 Greek, 4 Spanish Jews, a Serb, an Armenian, a Turk, and a Montenegrin boy. As we talked freely and played together, as we made warm friendships, we came to know things about one another's ways which, viewed from the outside, might have appeared strange and meaningless.
At the time Siaki was growing up in Salonika, the city had the largest Jewish population in the Balkans. Most were descendants of Jews who had been expelled from Spain in the 16th century. They still spoke a form of Spanish known as Ladino, and they maintained their distinctive customs and styles of dress.
The upper-class Jewish women of Salonika were noted for their finery. They had preserved traditions that they had brought with them from Spain. So they liked to go around with sort of fur-lined tunics or cloaks, as in fact the men did, and with their hair grown long, a bit like some kind of medieval court dress. The Jewish community, which was very large, covered the gamut from poor barefoot street urchins to some of the wealthiest individuals in the empire.
Leon's pictures are a poignant reminder of the Jewish communities that were once such a vibrant part of Balkan life.
It's a beautiful picture for many reasons, I think. One is there's the urban backdrop. It's not at all romanticized. The poverty of the cellar is there for everybody to see. At this time, life is conducted on the streets. In many ways, you feel that they are fascinated by the street sellers because they represent a vanishing world.
In 1913, Muslims made up a quarter of the population of Salonika. To many early Western visitors, they added an exciting and exotic flavour to the life of the city.
Europeans had always been fascinated by the Muslim character of the Ottoman Empire. They are never really seen by West Europeans as European. Muslims, however westernized, however urbanized, however much they speak West European languages, belong to a different culture and civilization. And that, I think, is constant throughout the period, and no doubt for many people it's true today as well.
Leon's autochromes depict lives that were apparently untouched by conflict. But some reveal that in reality, this was a city under siege.
Salonika in 1913 was full of soldiers because, although the Ottomans had been pushed out, the war wasn't over. And there are substantial contingents of Greek soldiers and Bulgarian soldiers roaming the city. And when you look at the photographs that look down over the city from the fort at the top down to the bay, you'll see the bay is full of warships as well. So this is a city at war. It's not a city at peace.
After their victory over the Ottomans, both Greece and Bulgaria claimed Salonika as rightfully theirs. But as these pictures show, it was the Greek forces that prevailed.
These are Cretan soldiers, and they belong to the Greek army who occupied Salonika. Cretan soldiers are dressed in a different costume than other Greek soldiers because it is their own costume. It is the local Cretan's costume, and even today they are wearing the same trousers in Crete.
The Greeks controlled the city for the next 30 years. Under their rule, the population of Salonika would change out of all recognition.
When you look at photographs of the city in the spring and summer of 1913, you are in fact seeing a world that is about to disappear. We know what its future will be. Its future will be Greek. And in the space of 10 years, the whole of the Muslim population will have left. In another 20 or 30 years, the entire Jewish population of the city will also have gone.
4 years after these photographs were taken, fires spread through the center of Salonika. Many of its ancient buildings, including the Jewish quarter, were destroyed. After Salonika, Brune and Leon travelled inland towards Upper Macedonia. Home to a diverse array of ethnic groups, Brune believed that this area would shape the future of the Balkans. Brune later wrote,
"It seems that different groups of people have mixed together to form a population where there is more confusion between the races than anywhere else. Everyone lays claim to their part, and this is where the greatest struggle takes place."
Ottoman Macedonia at this time was home to a number of different populations. There were Turks,
Orthodox Christians, Slav-speaking, Bulgarian-speaking,
Albanians, Serbs, Bulgarians,
Turkish-speaking Muslims,
Vlachs, Gypsies.
It was really very complex, very complex.
The pictures show that Macedonia was home to nationals from throughout the Ottoman Empire, including people from as far away as North Africa. But within this complex mosaic, one nationality is conspicuously absent. In Macedonia, few describe themselves as Macedonian. Most people had no conception of what it meant to belong to a Macedonian nation.
They were not very much concerned about nationalism or national identities. They had their religion, and their world was just their village. They never traveled away from their village, so they had no knowledge of the outside world.
In Leon's autochromes, which are the earliest known colour pictures of Macedonia, the details offer subtle indications of allegiance and identity.
A dimension of life that the photographs provide, which is missing from a lot of the other accounts from the time, is a picture of what rural life looked like. The particular clothing that you wore sent signals about your religion, possibly your village, certainly your social standing, and the images give us a little piece of that.
Dress was an important marker of identity. In earlier times, in the Empire, as in Western Europe, there had been dress codes. Different faiths were supposed to stick to different colours, of shoes, for instance, or of turbans in order to identify themselves. And something of that tradition remained.
The issue of national identity became increasingly important as the Serbs, Bulgarians and Greeks vied to win support from the territory's diverse populations.
In that period, we saw state-sponsored paramilitary groups from Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria, as well as indigenous armed groups from within Macedonia, all competing to try and establish a basis of national loyalty among this village population.
The Christians of Macedonia started to split along national lines as religious leaders vied to win the hearts and minds of the people.
Имаме огромен број случаи во кои што покажуваат како половина од селото.
There are documents which show that half of the villagers went to a Serbian church and half of the villagers went to a Bulgarian church. It resulted in a situation where two brothers would say that they are different nationalities. One of them would call himself Bulgarian, and the other brother would call himself Serbian.
And so, week in, week out, what people faced is stark choices when a band of this type came to your village. It could be a matter of life and death, what your answer to the question of, what are you really, was.
Jean Brun and Auguste Léon left the Balkans in May 1913, just 2 weeks before the argument over how to divide up Macedonia erupted into war. After a month of fierce fighting, the Bulgarian army was routed. The victors, Greece and Serbia, carved up most of Macedonia between them.
The peasants' their life changed totally. For some of them, they lost their homes. Hundreds, thousands of them lost their homes all over the region. So it was a dramatic moment of their personal and family histories.
Suddenly, some people found themselves on the wrong side of the newly drawn national boundaries. Amid rising religious and ethnic persecution, villages were attacked and burned. Thousands fled their homes. While working as a war reporter, Leon Trotsky witnessed the tragic impact that Macedonia's disintegration had on its people.
All the glories of culture are perishing. The work of fathers, grandfathers and great-grandfathers is being reduced to dust. Cities are being laid waste. Villages are going up in flames, and no end can yet be seen to this frenzy of destruction.
4 months later, Albert Kahn dispatched another of his photographers, Stefan Passé, to document the disastrous consequences of the Balkan Wars. When Passé arrived in Macedonia in September 1913, he found a region that remained in the grip of crisis.
Stefan Passé goes to places that are difficult to get to. He goes to the places that he knows are dangerous. He was informed by the French authorities of the risk that he took to go to such and such a place, but this didn't deter him. He wanted to go and see for himself and to take his photographs, and he wanted to bring them back for Jean Brun and Albert Kahn.
Travelling overland, Passé's intrepid journey took him through the war-torn countryside towards Salonika. Next to the railway tracks leading to the city, he witnessed the human cost of conflict.
It was the largest Muslim exodus. 500,000 Muslims left Macedonia to go to Turkey at that time. These people came to Salonika to board on ships to go to Turkey. They left their homes behind them forever.
There was a massive flight of people, refugees from the country villages where they'd lived for hundreds of years into the safety of Salonika and the surrounds, where these photographs have taken. Mostly it's Muslim villagers who now felt that their life was in jeopardy.
In a letter to Jean Brun, Passé described the plight of the refugees.
These unfortunates are without possessions, and at this time of year, when the earth is parched by the sun, they can no longer find food. Cholera is rife there. The Greek authorities do not seem to realize the gravity of the situation, and if serious measures aren't taken, there will be a terrible epidemic.
He knew very well that the place where he wanted to go was contaminated by cholera, but he was not afraid to go there. On the contrary, he had words of compassion for these downtrodden people who weren't receiving help from the government.
Passé's pictures record one of the great waves of Balkan migration that would recur across the region in the years to come.
The Balkan Wars were noteworthy for introducing the world to what it would later know as ethnic cleansing. One of the concerns of the photographers themselves in their photographs that we're looking at is to chart the consequences of ethnic cleansing. The consequences in terms of refugees who've been deliberately kicked out of their homes.
As the 20th century unfolded, attempts to build nation-states led to ethnic cleansing on an unprecedented scale. The Muslims and later the Jews of Salonika were some of the first people to pay the price. The pursuit of separate national identities propelled Europe towards war. It was a Bosnian Serb nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austro-Hungary, the event that shattered Europe's delicate balance of political forces and set the continent on course towards its bloodiest ever war.
For a pacifist like Albert Kahn, a promoter of understanding between cultures, it's evident that the First World War was a shock. For him, as for the rest of the world, but especially for a pacifist and an internationalist, it was without doubt desperate.
Albert Kahn wanted to use photography to record the diversity of human existence as a means of promoting international understanding and peace. In the years before the First World War, his photographers documented the timeless traditions of cultures across the continent. But Kahn's autochromes also bear witness to the emergence of nationalism, a potent force that would turn Europe's peace and stability into a cataclysm of ethnic cleansing and war.